Imagine being part of an army that, just a year ago, was hailed as invincible, only to find yourself surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, with your back to the sea. This was the dire situation faced by the British Expeditionary Force and its allies in May 1940. The German blitzkrieg had torn through Western Europe, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. In just 6 weeks, the Germans had conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and were now pushing deep into France. As the last remnants of the French army crumbled, the British Expeditionary Force found itself trapped in a small pocket around the port city of Dunkirk. The Germans were closing in on all sides, and the British knew they had to act fast if they were to escape. The situation was grim. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers were stranded, with limited food, water, and ammunition, and no clear way out. In the face of overwhelming odds, the British government and military leaders were faced with an impossible decision: risk everything to try and save their army, or abandon them to the mercy of the enemy. The consequences of failure were catastrophic: the loss of the entire British Expeditionary Force, and with it, the ability of Britain to continue fighting the war. The clock was ticking, and every minute counted. As the Germans tightened their noose around Dunkirk, the Allies knew they had to move fast if they were to have any hope of escape. The stage was set for one of the most daring and desperate operations of the war, the evacuation of Dunkirk. It would be a test of endurance, ingenuity, and sheer bravery, as soldiers, sailors, and civilians came together to try and pull off the impossible. As the Germans closed in, the situation on the ground grew increasingly desperate. Allied soldiers were running low on food, water, and ammunition, and the port city of Dunkirk was in chaos. The streets were filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the constant rumble of artillery. The British Expeditionary Force was on the brink of collapse, and it seemed as though all hope was lost. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, the British military leaders refused to give up. They knew that if they could just hold on for a little while longer, they might be able to pull off a miracle. The plan was to evacuate as many soldiers as possible by sea, but it was a daunting task. The Germans had already destroyed much of the port's infrastructure, and the few remaining ships were under constant attack from the air. The British Navy had assembled a fleet of vessels, including warships, ferries, and even civilian boats, but it was unclear whether they would be enough. As the soldiers waited anxiously on the beaches, the Navy worked tirelessly to prepare for the evacuation. It was a race against time, and every minute counted. Meanwhile, the Germans were pushing forward with all their might. Their tanks and troops were closing in on Dunkirk from all sides, and it seemed as though nothing could stop them. The British soldiers were dug in, fighting bravely, but they knew they couldn't hold out for much longer. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the British Expeditionary Force hung in the balance. Would they be able to escape, or would they be trapped and captured? The world held its breath as the drama unfolded. As the hours passed, the tension mounted. The British soldiers were on edge, waiting for the signal to begin the evacuation. The Navy was ready, but the weather was against them. A thick fog had rolled in, making it impossible for the ships to navigate the treacherous waters. The evacuation was delayed, and the soldiers were forced to wait even longer. The Germans were getting closer, and the British knew they couldn't afford to wait much longer. The situation was critical, and it seemed as though time was running out. The fog that had rolled in was a double-edged sword. It protected the British soldiers from the German air raids, but it also prevented the Navy from beginning the evacuation. The British Admiralty knew they had to act fast, and so they made a bold decision: they would use the shallow draft boats, such as the little ships of the Thames, to ferry the soldiers from the beaches to the larger ships waiting offshore. These small boats, often used for pleasure cruises and fishing trips, were the only vessels that could navigate the treacherous waters and shallow beaches. The call went out for all available boats, and soon, a flotilla of over 700 little ships, crewed by civilians, set off from the southern coast of England towards Dunkirk. As they approached the beaches, the soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. The boats were a lifeline, a chance to escape the clutches of the Germans. The atmosphere on the beaches began to shift, from one of despair to one of hope. The soldiers, who had been waiting for what seemed like an eternity, were finally going to get their chance to escape. The evacuation was about to begin, and the world held its breath as the drama unfolded. The clock was still ticking, but the British had finally found a way to beat it. The Germans, however, were not about to give up. They knew that if they could capture the British Expeditionary Force, they would deal a devastating blow to the Allies. The battle for Dunkirk was far from over, and the fate of the soldiers still hung in the balance. As the little ships approached the beaches, the soldiers prepared to board, their hearts filled with a mix of emotions, fear, relief, and hope. As the little ships drew closer, the soldiers surged forward, desperate to escape the clutches of the enemy. The air was thick with tension, the sound of gunfire and artillery booming in the distance. The Germans, determined to crush the British Expeditionary Force, unleashed a hail of bullets and shells, trying to drive the soldiers back into the sea. But the British held firm, their resolve strengthened by the sight of the waiting boats. The first soldiers to board were the walking wounded, their injuries a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. They stumbled onto the boats, exhausted and shell-shocked, but grateful to be alive. Next came the able-bodied men, their faces set with determination as they clambered aboard. The crew of the little ships worked tirelessly, loading the soldiers onto the boats with all possible haste. It was a chaotic and perilous process, with the Germans doing everything in their power to disrupt the evacuation. As the boats pushed off from the shore, the soldiers felt a surge of hope. They were finally on their way to safety, leaving behind the nightmare of Dunkirk. But the journey was far from over. The sea was rough, the boats tossing violently in the waves. Many of the soldiers were seasick, their bodies racked with vomiting and cramps. The Germans, meanwhile, were relentless in their pursuit, strafing the boats with machine gun fire and sending shells screaming overhead. The little ships were sitting ducks, but they pressed on, driven by a fierce determination to save as many lives as possible. The evacuation was a race against time, with the Germans closing in on all sides. The British knew that if they could just hold on for a few more hours, they might yet escape the clutches of the enemy. The stakes were high, the tension palpable, as the drama of Dunkirk reached its climax. As the hours ticked by, the little ships made their way back to England, their holds filled to the brim with exhausted soldiers. The evacuation was proving to be a remarkable success, with hundreds of thousands of men already rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk. But despite the progress, the situation remained precarious. The Germans were still closing in, and the British knew that if they could just hold on for a little longer, they might yet escape the clutches of the enemy. As the soldiers finally set foot on English soil, they were met with scenes of jubilation. The British public, who had been following the drama of Dunkirk with bated breath, were overjoyed to see their boys coming home. The soldiers, meanwhile, were simply grateful to be alive. They had endured unspeakable horrors on the beaches of Dunkirk, and the relief of being back in England was almost overwhelming. As the evacuation drew to a close, the British began to take stock of their losses. The numbers were staggering, over 68,000 casualties, including more than 11,000 killed or captured. The material losses were equally severe, with hundreds of tanks, guns, and vehicles left behind on the beaches of Dunkirk. But despite these losses, the British were jubilant. They had saved their army, and in doing so, had preserved their ability to wage war against the Nazis. As the last of the little ships made their way back to England, the British knew that they had achieved something truly remarkable. They had pulled off a miracle, and in doing so, had ensured that the war would go on. The evacuation of Dunkirk was a testament to British resolve and determination, and it would prove to be a turning point in the war. The British had shown that they would not be easily defeated, and that they would fight on, no matter what. The legacy of Dunkirk would live on, a symbol of British defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers, sailors, and civilians who had taken part in the evacuation would never be forgotten. And as the British looked to the future, they knew that they would always stand together, united in their determination to defend their country against the forces of tyranny. As the last remnants of the BEF made their way back to England, the British people were left to ponder the significance of what had just occurred. The evacuation of Dunkirk was more than just a military operation, it was a symbol of hope in a time of despair. It showed that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward, always a chance for salvation. And for the soldiers who had fought so bravely on the beaches of Dunkirk, it was a testament to their own resilience and determination. The British had shown that they would not be intimidated by the might of the German war machine. They had shown that they would not be deterred by the prospect of defeat. And they had shown that they would always stand together, united in their determination to defend their country against the forces of tyranny. As the British people looked to the future, they knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. They knew that there would be many more battles to fight, many more sacrifices to make. But they also knew that they were ready. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that they had overcome the impossible at Dunkirk. The legacy of Dunkirk would live on, a reminder to future generations of the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers, sailors, and civilians who had taken part in the evacuation. And as we look back on those fateful days in May and June 1940, we are reminded of the enduring power of the human spirit. We are reminded that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we always have a choice. We can choose to give up, or we can choose to keep going. We can choose to lose faith, or we can choose to hold on to hope. And it is this choice that defines us, not just as individuals, but as a people. The evacuation of Dunkirk may be a chapter in the history books, but its message is timeless, that as long as we stand together, united in our determination to defend what we hold dear, we can overcome even the most